Good afternoon, guys. I think most of you are doing this in your lunch hour, so I will try not to keep you too long, and I hope you've at least all been able to grab a sandwich. Have you all received my handout? I think if just one or two of you say yes, then I know it's
yes. Yes.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you, guys. So what I'll do is, the handout is incredibly detailed, so we'll go through it in overview form, and then I'll take any questions at the end. Hopefully I'll only speak for about half an hour, so there'll be some time to take questions if I've timed this correctly. Now, today we're going to look at the law around transgenderism, gender identity issues, and in particular, how that comes into play in care proceedings and also in private children proceedings. Now, the reason I decided to do this is mostly because it's close to my heart. Of course, I'm a transgender woman, and we see more of these cases coming up in court. And there are many occasions where I notice that something happens and I think, oh, that's probably not what we should be doing, or oh, that doesn't quite follow the rules. And I thought, actually, I have an insight into this that perhaps would be very useful if I could distill to make things somewhat better for everyone. So that's the logic behind it. And I hope, therefore, that I'll be able to answer any questions you've got. Someone said they haven't had the handout. That's okay. I've seen a few people say they haven't had the handout. I think we're going to recirculate afterwards anyway. I'm going to make sure they do. And then if you have any questions, then come to me and I'll answer them through emails in. So to save time, let's make a quick start then. Today, what we're going to cover is transgenderism generally, so you have an understanding of what this means. Oh, I see someone's posted the handout into the Zoom link. Anyone hasn't got it, I think you can download it there. What transgenderism means as a general umbrella, how it relates in these proceedings when the parents might have gender dysphoria or being transgender themselves, when the children themselves might start to present as transgender and possibly have gender dysphoria, and kind of along the way, what we're going to do is go through some don'ts to stay on the right side of the terminology of appropriate in this particular area, and just understand what's acceptable and what isn't. And I say not acceptable very loosely because I appreciate a lot of it comes down to just not knowing what's appropriate to ask, not knowing what there is. So let's look first then at transgenderism generally. Now, I've taken some extracts here from the Mermaids website, and Mermaids is a charity that specifically supports and campaigns in respect of transgender children, of children with gender identity issues. So I took the view, and I work with this organization, so I took the view that their summary was quite useful. Most people don't understand this, but in essence, it comes down to this. Gender itself is seen as a social construct. We assign a gender to someone when they're born based on their body parts, and we don't pay much more thought to it on a day-to-day basis for the majority of people. Of course, sometimes your gender, your physical attributes don't always match how you feel inside, what your mind says is your gender, and gender as a social construct, therefore, I would say gets it wrong, because in fact, you might find someone who has a female mentality, like myself, who wasn't particularly born with the matching body parts. Now, that is where gender dysphoria comes in. And as it says here, gender dysphoria is the uncomfortable feeling some people get when they're different from that which they were given at birth. Now, if you do match, if your physical body matches your mind in terms of your gender identity, then you are classed as cisgender. And if not, then it's transgender. That is the term. Understand that. And what Mermaids also outlines there, and it's something we're going to consider later on, is about the distress that you can go through when you realize this or when you're exploring that process, and potentially to see that. So for instance, puberty is a huge trigger because, of course, before puberty, everyone's flat-chested, everyone's not as developed, and then puberty hits and you get facial hair, you get chest hair, you get breast development, and the gender identity side of things becomes so much more prominent as part of your life, particularly for children. So that is an overview of this whole cisgender, transgender thing. What I would say is this as well, is transgender is more of an umbrella term that is used for lots of different subcategorizations underneath of how people identify. But don't get it confused, of course, with people who are gender fluid. So they will go between genders depending on how they feel. That is perfectly acceptable, and that is something that you need to be alive to as a practitioner that you may come across. Now, let's turn over the page, and there's a do's and don'ts section, which I thought might be quite helpful to get. And in particular, I think it's right for these reasons. The first one, get the name correct, don't dead name. Now, I don't know if people know what dead naming is. Let me explain that. So I was very fortunate because my mother named me Reagan. Reagan is a unisex name. So when I transitioned, I carried the name over, and that's fine. But I suspect if someone was called Dave, Dave doesn't carry over into a female name. So they may choose a new name for themselves. When they have transitioned over and they have decided, actually, I'm going to start this process of transitioning, I want a new name for myself. In essence, that previous life is considered, of course, there are exceptions to this, but generally considered dead in a way. It's a life you don't live anymore. It's a life that you shouldn't have lived. You realized that you were going to make a change. You decided that for your own mental well-being. And so the concept of dead naming is quite a shameful, but also quite disrespectful. When people go, well, what was your name before? Well, actually, I don't want you to know what my previous life was. I don't want you to know that previous person. I want you to know the person who I am now, because I have made efforts to become this person and to become myself. So you should always err on the side of caution and don't dead name. I have seen in a few cases that judges, when they've had transgender parents, will refer to, and I'll make this one up, Kimberly, who then brackets who was previously known as, and does that. I would err on the side of not doing that and actually flag it to the judge and say that that is something that can be distressing for a transgender person and goes against the identity that they create for themselves. And that's why I flag it there. Get the pronoun correct. And actually, no one is offended if you say to someone, I'm sorry to ask, but I want to get this right. What pronoun would you like to go by? And people will give you that. People will gladly understand that you're making an effort and give you that. And that is important to get throughout. I have a case at the moment with a young girl who may, and I put it no higher, may be wishing to transition. But the difficulty is, or rather difficulty for her, is everyone, including the child's solicitor, sadly, keeps saying her. And I just did it myself. I said the difficulty for her. And she has said that she would like to be known as they. So in fact, the right term to use would be they in that circumstance. And as I said, did I make that mistake? I'm not explaining that to you. But I think it's important that we make the effort to get that right, because it's so important for a person's identity. Could I just ask that you all mute yourself, because I'm being told that there's a slight bit of feedback, which makes sense. So then the second point, the third point, realization of gender dysphoria can happen at any time. Now, I think my own life experience is really important with this one to make the point. You can have children who know from a very young age. And I think we all accept that the way the world has evolved and become more tolerant, children are more willing to speak up from a young age. But I didn't. I came from a really conservative culture. And I knew, when I was little, I knew that in my head, I was one of the girls, but did I know that that meant I was transgender? No. And I have to say, until I was 22, 23, I didn't really know. And then one day the penny just dropped and I thought, oh, this is why you're like this. That's what that means. That means you're transgender. So it can happen at any point. You know, you just can't predict when this is coming, although I am going to try and help you to see ways that possibly you can think, oh, that might be a possibility. Be careful that this is complex and clarity can evolve. And what I mean by that is, and we will go through the case law, there are instances where people think, oh, I'm a girl and I want to transition to be female. And actually, they start that journey and then realize, oh, I'm not fully there. As we all, I'm sure you've all heard, gender is a spectrum, and you can sit anywhere on that spectrum. Now, I sit very female on that spectrum, and I have transitioned fully and live full-time as a female. Not everyone does that. Some people will marry and have a happy life living as a male and a male figure in that family, but actually have moments or days or months where they live as female in certain settings, and they are comfortable enough with that, and that is where they sit on the spectrum. So the issue can evolve sometimes, I think, in my experience as a transgender woman, when people first realize that they think, oh, I'm female, I need to transition. And then once some thought goes into it, you may continue that road, or you may turn around and say, actually, no, I don't sit all the way across that path. And you have to be alive to that, particularly with children who can of course, children, I think children, from my experience, can be very matter of fact, can't they? I want this, I know this. And actually it isn't always that simple, and they can come back on that. But don't worry, we'll go through that in the case law, because it has come up, and we'll discuss it. Not everyone wishes to have gender reassignment surgery, and be careful with the born in the wrong body phrase. I purposely have avoided using that phrase for this reason. Gender reassignment surgery, for me, I see it as when I look at this, the process of how this evolves, it is almost one of the closer the final stages, and there's no final stage, you're always transitioning, but in terms of the physical process, it's closer to that end. And not everyone wants that. Not everyone wants that final surgery. And so we shouldn't assume that someone will want it. We shouldn't assume that children will want it. We shouldn't assume that people have had it. Quite frankly, as I said, gender is a social construct. And if you see that someone lives full-time and identifies full-time as male or female, that is all you need to know. It doesn't really matter what the downstairs body parts are, because the reality is we don't go up to people on the street and say, what's your downstairs body parts? And then that is why I say don't use the born in the wrong body, because for some people, their body parts, they're happy with it, and they don't want to have that full surgery. So try and explain it if you can, the way I have done, which is that your mind doesn't necessarily match the gender you were assigned at birth, which I think is a right way to look at it. Transsexual as a term, now that is the last thing on my list, and again, I mean, I'm telling you all of this, and obviously some people have different preferences. Some people will say I'm fine to be dead named and all the rest of it, but transsexual as a term was something that was used quite prevalently in the 50s and the 60s, and for me and for many transgender people, it carries the term it carries sexualized connotations, and I'm sure many of you will know transgender people can sometimes be seen as a fetish object and a sexualized object. And for that reason, some transgender people don't like the term transsexual. I certainly don't. So that is something to be mindful of, that actually that term is very dated in the eyes of many people. The reason I spent the time going through that is because, of course, when you stand up as lawyers to make your submissions to the court, when you will put recitals in orders, we want to get it right. And I hope that little list will help you. Now, if we turn then to transgender parents in children law, this has come up more so in private children than it has public children, but it has come up across the board. Not as often as perhaps I would have hoped when I was looking this up and getting this all together, but it's there. So let's start with the first point there. Is a transgender parent a parent if not biologically related? Now, I think the case of J and C is very important. That was a 2006 case, and I have to say, even reading the judgments, you can feel the shift of the way the judges think and the way they have responded to changes in society from a 2006 wording of this issue to 2017, which is the most recent case I think I have on this handout, wording of the issue and how they view it. But in essence, the case came down to this. Couple got married, they had children by artificial insemination. When they went to get divorced, then the wife realized that the husband was female at birth because the birth certificate said female. So in essence, she had been deceived through the entire marriage about this issue. She was able then to get her marriage seen as null and void. And what followed then was the husband, if I use that term, the husband in the marriage, seeking to have contact and to see the two children. Now, therefore, the court had to look at, is this person a parent to the child? Because, of course, it was artificial insemination. The person J, Mr. J, was not biologically related to the children because they'd used artificial insemination. And the court then looked at this case and reached the conclusion, and you'll see it's all set out there, that in fact the Family Law Review Act, Reform Act even was the relevant section to turn to when looking at this particular issue. You can still be a child of the family if you both consent at the time of artificial insemination. But interestingly, then went on to find that because of the deceit that had taken place in the marriage, that in fact this wasn't a void marriage in the typical sense of the word. So it's if two persons of the same sex contrive to go through a surrogate marriage, the ceremony is not matrimonial at all. It is certainly not a void marriage, because in essence, void marriages could still allow you to be a parent, and the court construed it actually that wasn't allowed in this case. And that isn't the way to look at it. But I still put it down there for a couple of reasons. A, you're not going to see that kind of case, I imagine, again. It was very, very subtle, and maybe it'll come up again, but I think it was quite an interesting case on its own particular facts. But B, it does tell you where to go in cases of artificial insemination, how the transgender parent can still be recognized as a parent through the Family Law Reform Act, and ultimately what issues might come up when looking at that issue. I also noted there a section that was quoted from Corbett and Corbett, and that is on the last paragraph that I quote from it. Now, Corbett and Corbett was an interesting case. It was a case to do with a transgender model who had married Mr. Corbett, and they were looking to get divorced. And the court had to then look at this issue of, were they ever properly married? And at the time, which of course was 1970, the view was taken that in this sense, marriage was between a man and a woman, and because the model, who was Mr. Corbett's wife, did not, was born as male. I'm being very careful with my language here, as you can tell, was born as male, then that was not between a man and a woman. And that was because they drew a distinction between gender, which is a social construct, and sex, which was taken to be the view of, well, that's how you're biologically born. Your sex is what you're biologically born with. Now, pausing there, I should say that's changed for many reasons. One of the obvious reasons is the Gender Recognition Act, which now allows transgender people who have lived full-time for 2 years or have undergone gender reassignment surgery to apply for a gender recognition certificate, which in essence is like a new birth certificate, giving you a new sex on the paper. And then you can be female even if you were born with male body parts. And in essence, therefore, that would get around the rule. But also we now know that gay marriage is something that is available, and people can have gay marriages. And so in marriage itself is a wider concept. I would say that those are important things to think about when it comes to looking at parents, when it comes to looking at marriages, because the position has shifted. But you'll see there, my view is that when it comes to dealing with this issue in terms of transgender parents, speaking to children about it, working with them, it's all about planned work. That's what I said. It's exactly the same as issues of parentage, where we would be very careful what we do, who we speak to, think about going in with the information, including with the children, and doing it in a sensitive and appropriate way. I have included there as well the section of the Gender Recognition Act, whereby you can see that parental responsibility carries over, even if someone changes gender. So you'll have that reference if you need it. And then, of course, there's this big topic, isn't there? Is the father of the child still the father if the father transitions and becomes female? Now, the court looked at this issue, a judgment I don't particularly like, but there you have it, it's still the law. In 2019, so in fact, that's my most recent case on here. And in fact, you will see that the view in that case, the issue was this. It was a transgender man who had carried his own child, given birth to his child, but wanted to be known as the father on the birth certificate. The court took the view that actually this transgender man was the mother, because mother wasn't something that you get by virtue of being the female in the child's life, the female figure, if I put it like that. But in fact, it was because being a mother is the status afforded to a person who undergoes the physical and biological process of carrying a pregnancy and giving birth. And I mentioned that because when we think about these cases, and I'm sure you would have come across it, we have those instances where we think, oh, is it the respondent father still? Is it the respondent mother? Is it the applicant mother? Well, actually, it still is. And that's what the law says at the moment, that it's about the process of how you do it. So a transgender man will still be the biological mother of the child. I personally would err on the side of caution in my practice, and I will err on the side of caution, and I will say the first respondent, the second respondent, the applicant. Not because it would necessarily be wrong in law in how you address them, but I think from a social perspective, it can be hurtful to be labeled in a way that socially is associated with a particular gender that you have worked very hard, and it is a very hard process to overcome and to be the person that you are. I think we should all be very alive to the fact that, so for me, I have spent many, many years transitioning, and thankfully I don't get misgendered very often, but if I do and someone says he, that cuts very deep. And so I imagine it would cut very deep for a parent in those proceedings, even if you're on the right side in terms of the law. And so I would just err on the side of caution with that. Alternatively, you'll see I put at the bottom that parent is an open term to use. So you can always just refer to them as the parent, the respondent parent, the first respondent parent, the second respondent parent. And that way it's a lot more neutral. Okay, so let's turn to the issue of contact then, and or caring for children. And this is where I've included some case law, but I think it has to be managed in a social context also, what happens in people's everyday lives. One would think that, of course, the child's well-being would be the most important thing, and it is. But of course, children don't get raised in a vacuum or in a bubble. They have family around them, they have friends around them, and the views of the primary carer are just as important, because what we have to understand is the primary carer will be the one that has to support the child with this transitioning process, with the new information. And so if they aren't on board, if they aren't fully accepting, if they are, and I use bitter for want of a better word about it, which will happen when families break down and there's a lot of parental acrimony, then that can have a knock-on effect. And I would say you need to be conscious not just of the child's well-being, but of the family member that you're working with. So what can we learn from these cases? Well, we have the Reagan case, and it was a case before Lord Justice Wall. And in essence, it was an 8-year-old boy. His biological father had objected to orders that the son be told about the father's transition. So the mother wanted to tell, and the father was saying, no, don't tell my son, because that will harm the relationship that I have with my child. And the court took the view that it is very important that we should now, if possible, get things right so that the relationship can be restored at an early age. So early intervention, don't put this off for years. Don't think, oh, when they're older, we can then have these discussions. They're honest discussions to have that should happen sooner rather than later to promote the relationship moving forward. I think there's another side to that, isn't there? Because if your body's changing as a person and this child's going to be seeing that change, I do think there's an element where you're going to cause confusion, you're going to cause upset, misunderstanding if it's not properly grappled and dealt with. And that is something I think we have to be alive to. In essence, the no delay principle applies for many reasons there, mostly because the changes, if there are to be any physical changes, will impact on the child in terms of what they see, what they experience. Re-see then, another case similar to this and on the issue. In this one, though, interestingly, the father had changed gender. The mother said that she wasn't willing to tell the children that the father had changed gender. And the first instance court decided that they would make what we call a 20-month moratorium, an order preventing, allowing the mother not to tell them, I think, until about 28 days before that 20-month moratorium was about to run out. And actually, the Court of Appeal didn't agree with this. And what they said is, in fact, the children should be told sooner rather than later. They would hope that the mother would come on board, who was the primary carer, and take on the advice of professionals, work with professionals on how to do this. But actually, in terms of the children having a relationship with that father figure, who, even if they transitioned, as I said, is still the father, they needed to be the issue needs to be grappled with sooner rather than later. Something that the court was really alive to, interestingly, in this case, was this as well. We're all on social media. We live in a world where if you can keep a secret, that's great. But with social media and all the rest of it, and iPhones, I swear, listening into us when you see the adverts pop up, you know, can you keep something like that a secret with the physical changes, with the people that think, the fact that people talk? Are the children at risk of finding this out through a different means other than through a proper, planned, structured discussion? And the court was very alive to that in that case, that actually you need to be conscious of those things. And again, another reason why it's better to do it sooner rather than later, and do it in a planned and appropriate way, because if the children find out in a different way, it could cause them some level of emotional and psychological harm. So that is what those cases tell us. And I want to, of course, flag that here it says circumstances can vary. Many children accept it easily. I've had a case where the teenager, I think she was 15, wanted nothing to do with the father who had transitioned, and I was for the father on that case. But interestingly, she was fine with the fact that her father had transitioned and I was now living as a woman, because that's society, isn't it? Some people, and I think children as well, children adapt to these things a lot better sometimes than we give them credit for. They're raised in a new generation, aren't they? So this child had no issue with the fact that her father was now living as female. She would refer to her father as she. She would call her father by her new name. She refused to call her father dad or father, but would say that's the sperm donor, and call the father the that wasn't an issue for this child. And in fact, this child was completely fine with the gender identity side of things. So I flag that because actually some cases on these issues will be much more straightforward. Children will be so much more open to it. And other cases, you might need to think about what work needs to go in to bring this relationship between the child and the parent back to where it needs to be. I flag it here because, of course, we do get cases in public children proceedings where parents want to care for children, and you may well get a case where a particular parent wants to care who is transgender, who is about to undergo the process, or who has undergone the process. And if so, I would be saying to you, and certainly if I represented that parent or the guardian or the local authority on that case, I would be saying that the fact that they're transgender should not rule them out as a carer. And in fact, one of the issues you will have to look at as part of your assessment is how can you, what appropriate work needs to be done to rebuild the relationship to the point where the child could potentially live with them. And then that will have to deal with what specialist services are out there, timescales for completing that work. And that is all very important. So I flag it here so you are alive to that and can advise any social workers or raise it with the court if that is an issue that needs to be grappled with. And here I've written, experts can serve a pivotal role in this matter. And you have the case of Re-F there, children 9 and 12 lived with both parents. When the father left, the elder child was unaware of the dysphoria, but a psychiatrist came in to help both of the children to overcome this. Now, I'm not saying that's an easy piece of work, and sometimes that can take years, but I do think that any final care plan for children needs to grapple with that. It should be coed in the sense of it identifies how to rebuild that relationship for that child with their parent. And that links me on quite nicely, when I say that, to Re-M, which was the 2017 decision I was thinking about earlier. Now, here we had a situation where a very ultra-Orthodox community was where the children were based with the mother, and Peter Jackson decided that actually direct contact would have been too harmful because it could have ostracized them from that community. They, of course, would have had their own influences from that community on them and their view of transgenderism. And the Court of Appeal didn't agree, and in fact gave, as I put there, 138-paragraph judgment saying, actually, no, this wasn't good enough. And actually what the court needs to be doing is looking at themselves as the judicial, reasonable parent. And that must involve, as a reasonable parent, accepting that society changes, that society is tolerant, that transgender people have equal rights, and in fact they need to be, their identity needs to be respected and promoted. And actually, how does the court, as a reasonable parent, then look at the situation to decide what's best for that child? And it must be by informing that child appropriately, by teaching that child tolerance through proper work, and trying to rebuild and promote the relationship with that parent. And I flag that here because I think that is important for every care plan in care proceedings where this issue may come up. It's important in private children. The second element of that, and I do flag it here, the judges, and we know this, judges have a positive duty to attempt to promote contact. And I'm not going to go through all this judgment and the quotes I've put there because you'll be able to see it. But what you have to be alive to is possible discrimination. The judges, the learned judge should persevere and never say never when it comes to contact and promoting that relationship. Interestingly here as well, what happened was the court decided that the state can impose restrictions on the religious beliefs and of course the Article 9 rights that come with that, if it served a proper purpose, which in this case it felt it would have done. So that is something to be alive to, that even with competing rights, it's an important consideration for this child, for their relationship and for their life with their parent, that should be attempted and promoted at all costs. I would say at all costs, as much as possible. Okay, so that is how you deal with issues from when you have oppositions from parents, from culture, from the wider family, and even from the children. It's all about the specialized work that can be done to promote that relationship, to rebuild what is there. Sometimes that involves educating. It can involve experts working with children, like we had in one of our cases, to overcome any phobias. It can involve direct work with the primary carer to bring them around. And I'm not saying these answers are quick or that it takes, months to do this. Sometimes cases may conclude with a long-term plan of work, and that is just the reality of the situation. But all attempts need to be made to rebuild the bridges that may otherwise be strained as a result of transgenderism as an issue in this area of law. Okay, so then we have this case, Riel. I've given you a brief summary on this one. So unmarried couple separated with their daughter for 4 years, presented as female in public. This is the father, but then presented as male for the contact, and the mother took the view that this wasn't something that could work properly long term. Actually, the judge took the view that the father, and I will say the father, displayed sufficient commitment and attachment to get a PR order, and adjourned the issue of direct contact to get some work done with mom, to bring mom round. He noted transsexuality, and again, I don't like that term, but there we are, it's from 95, is a huge challenge for any family, particularly when its emergence postdates the breakdown of the relationship, and when its progress is so rapid, and when its disclosure is through antagonistic and not cooperative channels of communication. So we do have that element of acceptance and understanding by the court, but also the need to show that efforts are being made. What can we learn? Well, we can learn here that the primary care, the people around the child are important. They may need work done with them, but that things can be done to try and overcome the difficulties that they may have. Work needs to be done with the children in a planned, truthful and appropriate way, I would say with no delay in that respect. Contact should be taken at an appropriate pace. And I want to think about that in particular because, so for instance, on that case, Riel, we had a father who hadn't seen the child for 9 months, during which time she had undergone certain processes and changed physically in terms of how she looked. And we need to think about things like that because, of course, if the child then sees after 9 months, daddy, who they, and I say daddy in the sense of they call them daddy, as a different person entirely, that is something that needs to be managed appropriately. Discussions need to be had beforehand. Maybe photographs need to be given first to allow the child time to process. And so I flag it there to say, it's not about being rushed, not when you have these issues to play with and the children accepting that, because even as adults, it's incredibly hard to accept when people physically change what they look like in this way. The non-transgender parent often becomes a primary carer and is their primary support. So therefore, therapeutic input may be important for them. And of course, the emotional challenges and the potential damage if it's not done properly. So if they find out in their school by some bully in school that their father is now a woman or is identifying as female, that can be more harmful than if it's properly managed. So let's look then of informing them of the new identity. And here we have the case of Reese that we looked at earlier, but it's got some relevant paragraphs, I would say to you. Professional help should be on board, really, to help with that. Sometimes there is a bespoke package that can be put together, like in this case. So in this case, we had a NIAS worker come in, Patricia Morrison, who could do very specific and bespoke work with this family around transgenderism, around the discussions to happen with the primary carer, around the discussions to happen with the child, the work to be done. And the court endorsed that as correct because the expert, Dr. Bester, had also taken the view that that was correct. Interestingly, it says here, this is para 22. This is not work, in my judgment, which could probably be given to or carried out by CAFCAS. Dr. Bester has identified NIAS as the specialist resource required, and in my judgment, this is a clear case for the employment of NIAS. I'm sure a few of you have come across NIAS, and they do a lot of work in care proceedings as well. But it just goes to show that, in fact, when these issues come up, it is always worth exploring the avenues and the channels that are out there to see what best package is available for your particular case. Now, we do cover that in the handout a little bit as well. Then in RETI, there is a recognition that actually this is hard for everyone, but in particular the children concerned, but that actually her welfare and what has occurred, the child can adjust to change, it says, maintain a relationship with the parent. And that is true. Children are more susceptible and able to maintain and to adapt to situations, and we mustn't lose sight of that when we think about this issue. I've run out of my time, so I'll do this last section relatively quickly. So transgender children then, this is where the child themselves might decide to transition or might start to show signs of dysphoria, and you, as the lawyer on the case, will look at it and think, oh, we need to deal with this issue, but how? So there I've put Press for Change. Press for Change is like, it's an activist group, it's a support group who have been campaigning for trans rights for decades. And they issued some guidance that was specifically for schools, but actually, having gone through it, it provides a lot of really good information that I would say would be really useful for us to know about. So I've summarized some of it here where I thought it's appropriate. So let's start with this one. This is the signs to look out for. This is something from Press for Change. There's also something from my own knowledge and something I've read about myself. But in essence, when you're approaching these cases, I always think you can never know, can you? Like I said, these things come up out of the blue. But there are certain signs that perhaps if you start to see at an early stage, you may think, oh, that might be an issue that we consider later on. And I certainly had that in one of my recent cases where the child was wearing a binder across their chest very early on when we issued the proceedings. And to everyone else, that didn't seem like an issue. But to me, I thought, that strikes that it may have an element of dysphoria in it. And I put it no higher than that. I flagged it because I was for the local authority. I flagged it to the social work team. 9 months later, the child has decided that they're agender, that they want to have this issue fully explored. And I hate to use the phrase, it's all kicked off, but it has. It's all evolved and gone down that route. Now, that is something, therefore, that sometimes you can spot early just to be alive to in case you need to revisit it. And here we have some signs. So dressing in clothing associated with the opposite sex. And again, you'll say to me, well, some girls do that and they're classed as tomboys, and that's true. I'm not saying this is a foolproof list, but it would help you to spot certain things possibly. Issues with the body during developmental years, and that is the puberty issue I talked about, when the breasts start growing and the child in my case wanted to wear a binder, didn't like the fact that the breasts were growing. Issues when beginning to have the first romantic relationships. Now pause there a moment, let me explain that. People tend to get confused between gender and sexuality. You can be, your identity as a person, so for me, I identify as female, is not determinative of who I am attracted to. And I've always found men attractive, and even when I transitioned, I still found men attractive. For children who start to develop their early romantic relationships, that sometimes can be the point where there's a trigger, because they are then understanding the roles in relationships, they're understanding what role they wish to play in a relationship, and it can be a very early sign that actually, oh, I'm playing a role that isn't traditionally given or wouldn't be traditionally identified with how my body is and how I identify myself. perhaps I am, and they go down that path and they start to think along that way. So it's always useful to keep an eye on that. Repeated instance that he or she is the opposite gender. Repeated insistence, that's what I meant, sorry. So yeah, so some kids just tell you, some children just tell you, don't they? I'm a boy, stop calling me a girl. And if they do that repeatedly, it's an early warning sign. Persistent preference for cross-gender roles. Strong desire to play stereotypically gendered games. Now that one is from Press for Change. I wouldn't necessarily say that's a sign, but they seem to think it is, and they have more experience than me. Can be present at any age, as I said, and it can be present without any signs. So just be alive to those issues generally. It may lead nowhere on your cases, but as competent lawyers, as competent professionals working in this area, we should at least know the kind of things that may lead to this issue coming up. The Royal College of Psychiatric guidance then about the management of this issue, and what they had said in 1998 about it was, in fact, and this is very important, it's a point we covered earlier, fluidity may return again at a later stage. It is the possibility of change of outcome. Now, if I'm to give you an example in my life, when I first transitioned, I did have a very short period, it wasn't very long, where I thought, oh my goodness, is this right for me? Should I go back? Is this how I want to live? Now for me, I overcame that and I thought, no, this is how I want to live. That's exactly what it is. And and actually, to be fair, this is the best decision I've ever made for my life. But I know for some people who are friends of mine, they decided, oh, I'm going to be full-time female, or I'm going to be the full-time male. And then they found actually that isn't who I am. I don't sit that end of the spectrum, and they've had to come back. And the reason I flag that is because, as I said, gender is a spectrum, and you should never get in the habit of seeing rigid male and female. Okay, if they're not male, then they'll be female, they'll transition, and that's the end of the issue. Because actually, they may only go halfway through that process. You know, they may want to identify as she and her, but choose to wear boys' clothes. It is a spectrum. Everyone is different on that spectrum, and they sit in different places. And we should never let our social construct of gender cloud how that child should live their life, because as it says, it's fluid. There's a possibility that they go one way and then come back. We shouldn't give children the impression that the process is irreversible. And that kind of leads me nicely into the other element of this, which is, of course, we understand emotional harm comes from these kinds of issues. You can have bullying, isolation, lack of understanding. And I put there, especially for children born male. And that is because, of course, you'll all be familiar with toxic masculinity. The fact that I think it's one of those things where a girl can dress as a boy and it's completely acceptable, but if a boy dresses as a girl, it's seen as socially unacceptable. And so you have to be very alive that if someone who is male is presenting with these issues, they may well have a tougher time in school, in social circles. And so again, as a practitioner, be alive to that is something to keep an eye on. I've put there physical harm, perhaps less so, but actually having thought about that, I don't think that's right. And put a line through the less so part, because in fact, I can't remember what I meant by that, but in fact, there is the risk of suicidal tendencies. There is the risk of self-harming. When there is confusion around this issue, I don't know how to describe to you, but in essence, and I'm talking from my own experience, you go through a very long process of confusion, of not understanding why you're not complete, not quite understanding what it is that stops you being complete. And that can lead, for younger children in particular, to suicidal tendencies, to self-harming behaviours. Suicide rates amongst transgender people, and in particular youth, is at its highest it's ever been. And we have to be very alive to that. For me, when I started this, as I said, in my early 20s, I figured this out, that I was transgender, but I have to say there were many nights I remember where I would cry myself to sleep, but I wouldn't know why I was crying myself to sleep. I would be just not understanding why I didn't feel complete. What is it that was missing? And then the penny dropped one day, and I literally remember it very well, the day it dropped, and I thought, oh, you're transgender, that's why it is. And since then, that's gone away. But during that process of self-discovery, you get that. And we need to be very alive to that possibility. Children in foster care who have these issues, be very alive to that. Give the foster carers guidance on that. Give the parents guidance. Give the alternative, the wider family guidance. And there I've written psychological confusion and harm. And again, that's why work is very important, which is why we move on to what work can be done. We have here Intervention from a specialist service. Now pause that, I'll come back to that. But GP advice, GPs are more and more alive these days to the rules on the guidance on transgenderism, the need to refer to the gender identity clinic at certain stages. There is actually, and I'm sure it is, and I haven't put it on here and I've just thought about it, but there is actually some guidance from the GMC on this that's been sent that all GPs should have considered. So if you get a case, just look that up, find the guidance, make sure the GP is aware. Sometimes you might need a psychiatrist or a psychologist, depending on what issue needs to be addressed in that particular case. And then I've written there, what can happen? Well, you can get an early diagnosis. Sometimes that happens, but more likely with children of a younger age, you'll get consideration of a few things. You'll get consideration of counseling and psychological support in the first instance. Sometimes you get this, you get postponement of treatment using the gonadotropin releasing hormone. And what I say about that is this, that's the hormone, I'm sure you've all heard of it, that stops the body developing into puberty. So for children who start to show the physical attributes and find that they're self-harming, it's detrimental to them, they don't like the changes that the body's experiencing, that is an option to postpone puberty until they're of an age where they can figure this out. You're not making a decision for them. You're just hitting pause until they can figure this out, know where they sit and what it is they wish to happen with their body. I've written there, watch out for depression, self-harming and suicide. There's not a lot of English case law on this particular matter, but I've managed to find a couple of Australian cases. And one of them is this Alex case. And in that case, it was a 13-year-old girl about to begin puberty and decided and actually couldn't deal with it, and they did use the hormone and puberty was postponed because this child was at the point of suicide. This child, the view was very much taken that this is a real risk, this child will kill themselves if they develop breasts and curvy hips and all the rest of it, the kind of things that I always wanted. If this child did that, then they would have that difficulty, and so the court took the view that they were going to pause that. On the other side of it, we have Jamie from 2011, 10-year-old boy allowed to postpone puberty, but the judge didn't go so far to allow female hormone treatment. And the reason is because, and I quoted there, I simply cannot determine in 2011, when Jamie is still only 10, what is likely to be in her best interest in 16 or 17 when she's age 16. Notice there, though, that the judge does use the pronoun that the child wishes to be known by. And I think that's really important for the child's narrative, that we must do that as best we can at all times until we have full clarity around matters. Now, those are important judgments because they do show that, in fact, sometimes you don't need to go all the way with the transition process, but the best thing you can do for the child in terms of their welfare is hit the pause button for them while they figure it out. Some children don't need that. You know, I had my issues, but I didn't like puberty, but I survived it. I didn't self-harm. I didn't do anything like that. So some children with proper support can do it properly and figure this out. But other children at the more extreme of the spectrum, like Jamie, like Alex, need that proper support, and you need to be able to identify, how do we get there? Well, the Tavistock Portman Childhood and Adolescent Gender Identity Clinic is one of the services in London that has specialised in providing this treatment, but also in providing support for youths, in providing support groups, psychological input, helping them to figure out their gender identity. And that is really important when you get these kinds of cases, to think, well, where do we go? You can go, for instance, to LGBT workers, but how qualified is an LGBT worker in this particular issue? Most LGBT workers, and that's no disrespect to them at all, but most LGBT workers are more familiar with maybe the L or the G issues. Transgender issues are not something that everyone has the specialist expertise to consider, and that is not a criticism of them. How often do you come across transgender people and issues like this in comparison to how often you come across LGB issues? It's not as prevalent. So they do what they can, and I have never met a worker that hasn't done their best. But for some children, you need to go further. And as I said, you've got the GPs where the referral might go to the gender identity clinic. I've written there Mermaids. It's a charity dedicated to transgender youths and supporting them. And Mermaids can give good guidance, can take on board and let them into forums where they can discuss these matters with peers, with support colleagues. But of course, the clinic is there, Tavistock Portman Childhood and Adolescent Gender Identity Service, if it is needed. So let's look then. We've talked about postponing treatment and all the rest of it, and as a way that you may need to get to, and I'm not saying you do in the first instance, but it might go that far. Who can actually consent to it? Well, here we know that, and I won't repeat it, it's Gillick competence, isn't it? That children under 16 can do their own consenting if they're Gillick competent, they understand what's going to happen, and the physician makes a decision on that. 16 and 17-year-olds, well, Section 8 of the Family Law Reform Act allows them to make their own decisions. And again, they need to have all the information, but the physician will make sure of that, one would hope. So that is the issue of who can consent and how to deal with that. What other issues then may arise? Well, we've covered this briefly. They may later discover that they're not happy with the decision and wish to go back. They wish to transition back. And I think important in this then is exactly what I said earlier, is don't, when we support children through this process, we shouldn't see it as, oh, that child doesn't want to be male, that child will be female, and that's the end of it. We need to make sure that children understand that it is important that they can transition back to their ascribed birth gender. They will have their parents and their school's full support, and nobody will be disappointed with that. Because, like, in a way, you get just as much pressure, from my own experience, after you've transitioned one way, to not then go back. And actually, like I said, I never want, in the end, I decided very clearly I was not going back, and I'm happy. But I know many friends who then found the process coming back very difficult. And it's not an issue that's straightforward or easy to figure out. Without that acknowledgement, a child may well become too frightened of the consequences. And that, again, has an impact on the child's emotional well-being. So, of course, as we know, the Equality Act protects transgender people from discrimination. And I've written it there because if you're for a local authority or for CAFCAS, you want to know that, in fact, the Act kicks in the moment the person informs the organisation that they intend to undergo or are undergoing gender reassignment. And I would like you to see gender reassignment, again, as a social construct. That's not surgery. That's not starting hormones. Gender reassignment is saying, I wish to change my gender. I wish to explore this issue further. I might not be fully male or fully female. And that is where gender reassignment can commence sometimes. Other times it can commence where the child then speaks to a professional and decides that this is the road they're going to go down. They're going to start by wearing certain clothes. They're going to start by changing their names in school. For you as organizations, I would say err on the side of caution. And the second the child says it, treat it as kicking in. Treat it as you need to treat this with respect and listen to what the child is saying and get the appropriate support for them. Pretty in the United Kingdom then, right to private life in fact includes gender identification. And I think that's important for us to note when we come to make decisions for these children, because of course their welfare is one of the factors to be considered, which is linked into their rights under the European Convention of Human Rights and the Human Rights Act. And then we have Goodwin in the UK, which was a judgment that basically said that transgender people have a right to establish their identity as individual human beings as they see fit. So again, it's all about rights, it's all about respect and making sure we understand those issues. I'm just coming to the end of this now, guys, because I know I've taken longer than perhaps I wanted to. So I've written there, what should you do in the courtroom? And it spells out exactly what we've gone through this entire session. So identify the issue, don't ignore it, use the correct pronoun, use the correct name, be alive to specialist intervention and use it. Be alive to the risks of the child, the suicidal tendencies, the depression, the self-harming behaviors that could arise. Be alive to the possibility of them changing their mind and deciding to go back. And then I've written there, do you have threshold if parents do not support the child? And that, I think, is an interesting question. I couldn't find a case on it, but I would say yes, you can. You can. If a child is suicidal over this, how can you not have threshold if the parent won't support it, won't allow them to live the way that they need to survive? And how does this impact on the child's long-term care needs? And again, that is when you do your assessment of carers, they must, if this child has a diagnosis or has gender issues that need to be fully explored throughout their adolescence, that carer has to be open to that. And that links me in quite nicely with Ree J, which is a 2016 case. Now, this is an interesting case. On the paper, we have a child who was 7 years old, living with mom, and with mom, the child would present as a girl. But dad was saying, actually, the reason the child was presenting as a girl was because mom wanted the child to be a girl, and that's the end of it. And the child hadn't fully explored their identity yet. In fact, court found that dad was right about that. But it was interesting because the local authority were ordered to do a Section 37 report first and bought everything mom said, that in fact this is what the child was like, the child was female. And when the court looked into it later on, the court realized that actually when the child was out of the home with mom, so the child was then placed with dad, the child didn't know whether the child was fully male or female, was still figuring that out. In school was content to present as male, and then it led the court to the obvious conclusion, actually the reason the child was so strongly presenting as female was because of mother's influence. Now, I don't think the court in this case necessarily blamed mother for pushing some sort of agenda, but it was the way she had parented was very rigid. When she knew that this child had identity issues, she went down the path I'm telling you all not to go down, of the rigid, well then the child must be female. And actually dad hadn't done that in the parenting, and dad had said, I will allow my child to freely discover who they are with appropriate support, and I will support them along the way. I won't put them into a box, male or female. And ultimately the matter concluded with a care order with the child staying with dad. So that's something to be alive to, that in fact, these are many issues that we have to consider. We must be open-minded in approaching it, and there's no set rule. It's a social construct that you have male and female. There's lots of things in the middle and lots of places on the spectrum you can sit. So that is a very long handout that I've managed to go through in just about an hour, and I'm sorry for taking longer than you guys probably wanted to give me. But I hope that that's helpful to help you to understand this wide area of law that does keep propping up a lot on our cases. Does anyone have any questions that immediately jump out?
Reagan, can I ask a question? Iola Harris.
Hi, Iola.
Just thinking about sexual abuse cases and the kind of interaction between gender identification. Quite often we can see that as a trauma response, and just wondered what your views were about how to approach that, and whether you think some of the treatments available can work in cases like that, and the overlap and things like that. I suppose it doesn't matter why there's a need to identify as one gender or another, but sometimes that can arise as a trauma response out of sexual abuse, can't it?
Well, I think sometimes my view and what the literature would support is that it's inherently there. These gender identity issues, this dysphoria is there, but it may well be that the trauma brings it more to the forefront and makes it more of a live issue than it perhaps would have been before. But what I would say is err on the side of caution with that. If the child is exhibiting the kind of signs that make you think that this might be a case where we have a real gender identity issue, let a clinician assess it. Let one of the specialists assess the situation and come back to you on that. And I actually don't think a clinician is ever going to come back and say, this is definitely not a case with gender identity, but they may come back and say, well, it's probably not as far on as the child is initially presenting and they're still exploring. That's my advice on it, is get expert input earlier to understand, where is that, what issues are we facing here? What is the issue with the child's identity? How best to support that in any circumstance, and what specialist intervention is needed for this child? Which then links on to a question I just saw someone wrote in the chat, which is, do some of the support networks you highlight provide support to the young person's network? Yes, they do. Yes, they do. Mermaids in particular has a huge section on their website and does a lot of work with parents. So I know that later this year I was meant to go on one of their retreats whereby they were inviting not only the children but the parents and the family members to come along to be part of workshops and experiences and understand this better. So yes, they do.
Thank you very much. I've got to go because Miss Tyndall is calling me, so thank you, that's really helpful.
Thanks for joining, Iola.
Thank you.
Has anyone else got any questions?
I've got a question. It's Sarah Webster. I'm working with a young person at the minute who is female presented as male at school. He lives with his granddad, who doesn't currently have any parental responsibility. School are still emailing in the female name, and granddad is asking them not to because it upsets him. his nickname at the minute is initials rather than a big name change. That's just what he wants to be known as. But school is saying without a PR holder agreeing, they can't do that. But he's 14. I would assume that they should respect that.
Well, at 14, I would assume that he is Gilead competent. I mean, I could be wrong about that, but I would assume at 14 he is Gilead competent. He's made a decision. And I always think with this sort of thing, like I said, it's about that dead naming element, isn't it? If the child or the adult wants to be known at a certain name, what do we lose by referring to them as that name? We don't lose anything, do we? Everyone knows who we're talking about. There can be one document, like one court order that says as a recital, upon the court noting that this child now wishes to be known as this, and therefore all the other documents will refer to the child as this, and then we just do that. And it just saves so much distress for that young adult who, and I cannot stress enough, you misgender someone, you get their name wrong, and it cuts so deep. The amount of times I've thought, I've worked years to overcome what I view, and it is personal to me, what I view as the biggest hurdle that's ever been thrown in my life. I've worked years to overcome it. And then when I've had someone go Mr. or he, it's like the deepest cut back. It's like you've undermined everything I've done for that entire journey to do that to me. So I imagine if the child feels like I do, which they probably don't feel to that extreme, but will feel it to some degree, it's better, I would say, for the school in particular to be respecting that. And if they don't quite understand that, Sarah, then that organisation at the back of the handout, I'll turn to them, Press for Change. You will notice on the handout, Press for Change gave the, I'm just turning to it, the gender variant, child's right to attend school, a guide to UK law for the transgender community, parents and school. I would email them that link to say, please consider that document. Please ensure that you refer to the child appropriately moving forward, and see what they come back on that front. It's a nickname in essence because the child's legal name hasn't changed. So I don't understand why they're struggling with that. But yes, that's how I'd approach it, Sarah.
Thank you.
Has anyone else got any questions?
I've just got a quick question. It's Abby Allen speaking. I'm working with a child at the moment, and she's 16. We are going to refer to Tavistock Clinic, but with her being 16, there is a waiting list of 2 years, and we've been informed that obviously by the time the referral gets accepted, she's going to be an adult. So I'm just wondering if there's any other, obviously I know you've mentioned mermaids as well, but if there's any other places that we could go for advice or support or anything like that.
So it's a bit of a controversial area, if I'm honest. Is it Abby?
Yes.
Yes, Abby, it's a bit of a controversial area because, as you said, the waiting lists can be so long and extensive that, in fact, I always take the view that's a reason to go to an expert psychologist or psychiatrist to get further guidance. For instance, I know that Gender GP, or is it called GP Gender? Google one of those, Abby, is a private medical doctor in Wales who assists people with hormone therapy and the rest of it earlier on. But at the same time, I know that their service has gotten in trouble with the GMC in the past for doing that outside of the formal process. So I don't want to recommend somewhere without giving you the full information that in fact there are issues that come there. If it was my case, I would inquire with Gender GP or a similar service. So there are private gender companies and services out there to offer support. I would inquire what they could do. I would try to research where they're at and what they're known for and what the GMC says about them. And I would put all that information before the court and say, this may be an option, but in the interest of open honesty, this is what the option is, and it's got good and it's got bad in it. For me, it worked really well because I had a waiting list of 4 years. And after I'd made the decision that I was going to transition, I wasn't going to wait 4 years to start hormone therapy. And they were able to support me for those 4 years. But I know for other people, there have been criticisms of the agency, and I don't want to therefore recommend them. I think the easiest thing you can do is to Google it, private gender services, and to see what comes up. But there are companies out there that offer that, yes.
Okay.
I hope that's helpful, Abby. It probably wasn't.
No, that's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. Has anyone else got any other questions? No? Okay, wonderful. So guys, it's been an absolute pleasure doing this. I hope this handout is really detailed enough for you guys to use moving forward. If you have got any questions or cases like that, by all means, email into Chambers, they'll forward it on to me and I'll address it. Something might come to you later. And otherwise, thank you for taking the time to come and learn a little bit about this so that we can be doing this right moving forward. And best of luck in your cases. Good afternoon, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.